and welcome to another Every Other Friday Off. Today we're going to be installing and then testing two of the most popular cheap mods on the internet, commonly known as the Boost Leak mod and the Wastegate Adjustment mod. Now there are lots of videos showing you how to do these mods, but for the first time that I know of, today we're going to try to put numbers behind do they do anything for you. In order to show whether or not these mods actually do anything, we need some sort of baseline. The test we'll be using for comparison today is a rolling start, 20 mile per hour to 50 mile per hour, wide open throttle, timed run. This is really how I used the power of the Fiat during autocross, and it's what I'm most interested in. So I shifted into second gear, throttle wide open, about 18 miles an hour. At 20 miles per hour I start the timer, and at 50 miles per hour I stop it. I took several runs and was usually repeatable within a quarter second. So the first mod we'll be performing is what's called the Wastegate Adjustment. Whatever type of intake you've got, there's too many out there, get it out of the way. This mod is meant to address people's concerns that the wastegate either doesn't fully close or doesn't close quickly enough under boost, or perhaps even came from the factory adjusted incorrectly. The wastegate is fundamentally an engineered boost leak, so causing it to close sooner or more forcefully should theoretically raise boost and make more power. A lot of people who do this mods just add arbitrarily number of turns to the preload, but we'll be looking at what we're actually doing, how the actuator functions, and trying to do it with a little more of a factory adjustment. This mod doesn't require you to purchase any parts at all, truly a free mod, so there's really not that much to lose. Two 13mm bolts and one 13mm nut hold down the little bracket that kind of retains the heat shield. All three of those pieces of hardware need to be removed. Lift the bracket out of the way, and it's time to go after the heat shield covering the turbo. The three 10mm bolts on top of the heat shield will build up your confidence and make you think it's all going to be okay before taking on the next two bolts, which are a pain. The two problem children are nutted studs sitting right in the tiny little clearance between the front clip and the turbo. I used a ratcheting wrench, lots of cursing, and the patience that comes from raising children to get them off. It's a little bit of a jigsaw puzzle to get the heat shield off, but if you mostly work towards the driver's side of the car, it'll come right out. So now we get our first look at the wastegate actuator. From the factory, there's supposed to be 13mm of threads behind the jam nut. And look, mine is loose. That could be costing me some boost. Counterhold the actuator shaft, and you can back off the 10mm, of course, jam nut. And then I'm going to go ahead and pull the airline off of the actuator. That way I can test its function. The actuator is supposed to just start moving with a signal of 6 psi and move to full stroke around 15 psi. The gauge that came on your compressor is not accurate enough for this, by the way. That's why I've teed in a nicer gauge. As far as I can tell, this is working as expected, but I'm going to go ahead and use my vice grips to rotate the main shaft and bring it back to that 13mm factory number. And it's back to the 10mm to lock out the lock nut. With the adjustment, it's not much, but it does seem to be actuating just a little bit earlier. Pre-adjustment, it was around 7 psi, and now it starts moving around 5.5 to 6 psi. So there is some difference. Button everything up and test them out. Here we go. Holy cow, that is different. That's nearly 3/4 of a second faster. Now, my testing's not perfect, and you could easily argue a quarter second or more of error, but 3/4 of a second overall consistently across a lot of runs says this did something, which really surprises me. And with that done, let's move on to the boost leak mod. The factory EGR system uses a venturi to create vacuum when the manifold's at pressure under turbo operations. It's your boost driving that venturi. The idea is by rerouting around the venturi, we maintain that boost. You don't have to remove the green line from the actuator. I did to get out of the way, but you do want to pop the actuator off of its little pedestal to give you some room back behind the engine. Then go ahead and pop the short line from the T out of the other green quick connect. That little green line is clipped to the engine in the dark, blind behind you a couple of places, and needs to be popped out. Use the force. Once you've got it popped out, you'll see it winds around. It contains a check valve we need and ends up underneath your actuator at a T. Now, this whole system's made up of little plastic hard lines that are heat shrunk onto their barbs. I slit the hard line along the barb to split it, and there I'm using a screwdriver to pop it off of the barb. That frees up the whole piece that we chased across the backside of the engine, including the check valve. Here's that cutting process up close. I'm just slitting along the barb. We're doing it over on this side in order to save that check valve that we're going to need to put back into the system when we're done. There was no way to get good video in the car of making these cuts. Too much hands and fat guy in the way. But now, for your viewing pleasure, on the workbench and with absolutely nothing in his way, please enjoy the fat man struggling. Is he going to lose a finger this time? Does he poke himself through the hand? What cursing will he use when he does? It's drama like this that should make you think, I should subscribe to this guy's channel. It's fascinating. It's a good time to hit that like button and do what other things YouTubers say you're supposed to do for me. Alright, back in the car. We're going to cut and remove the short piece that we unplugged, and we're going to cut and remove the outboard part of the T. That runs all the way over to your intake. It runs all the way over to the plug on your intake, and that whole hard line needs to come out as well. We're going to save the little clip off the intake though. With that out of the way, we save the little clip, and the two pieces that we ended up saving from all those hard lines were the clip to the intake and the check valve. Don't lose them. Back on top of the engine, the T-fitting that we removed the lines from earlier, we want to go ahead and cap the two open ends with vacuum caps. Use something like silicone that can handle the temperature and retain them with zip ties. And underneath our actuator, we've got one more open T. We're also going to vacuum cap and zip tie over here, and that takes care of all of our vacuum cap and zip tie needs. And time to cut the big line. I went right about halfway. I should have biased maybe an inch towards the top. The goal is to have equal lines running smooth when you're all done. And now it's time to put our plastic Y in line with the line we just cut. The two legs of the Y that are closest to each other go into the two halves of the line that we just cut. The third leg of the Y is going to go over and tie back into our intake when we're all said and done. There are some people who let that third leg just vent to atmosphere. Your mileage may vary. My Y is a Teflon 3/8 inch Y that I got from Amazon, but a complete kit's available from other vendors. And now we're going to go ahead and tie in our line to the third leg that's heading over to our intake. This is just standard 3/8 inch ID emissions line that you can get from any auto shop. Wow, the fat guy's really breathing hard on this one. With those parts in place, you can go ahead and get your actuator back up on its pedestal, clip back into as many of the original clips and tube supports as you can, and kind of button everything up back there. For routing, I kind of ran the line around back, similar to the way the original line was routed. That keeps it out of the heat and lets me zip tie back to some of the original tubing supports. We still need to add our check valve in place. Now, I chose to put my check valve a good ways away from the actuator. Along with the Y, those are two strategies that supposedly will help prevent the check engine lights that are sometimes associated with this mod. I cut the hose at a good location for keeping that check valve out of the way. I'd put the gray end of the check valve back towards the actuator, the black end out towards the intake. And at the front end, you cut yourself to length for just being able to plug in the fitting we saved earlier nicely. And the original plug gets plugged into your intake. Everything gets zip tied, buttoned up, maybe even hose clamps if you're putting on airs. And there's your mod. So with everything buttoned up and put back in place, this is what the mod ultimately looks like. When I decided to make this video, I intentionally made the wastegate adjustment first. That was because I thought it didn't have much potential to really make much difference, and I thought if either of these mods was going to work, it would be this one. Now the wastegate has already made a huge difference. We'll see what this one can do. And away she goes. Looking good. That's another 0.2 picked up. Sorry about the graphic, the average was actually 3.73 with a 1/4 second deviation. So what have we learned? We picked up nearly a second with 2 cheap mods that I spent less than 20 bucks on. Going into this, I really didn't have much faith that either mod was going to make any difference whatsoever, much less a measurable result. I'm certainly not going to claim that I produced the most accurate results in the world. I could easily be off a couple tenths either direction. But across a lot of runs, the 3 different conditions of the car produced results that never ever overlapped, showing me that the mods really did do something, and it's something you should be able to feel on an autocross track. The next big doubt about my findings has to do with the ECU of the multi-air engine, which is a very advanced ECU. I do wonder if after time, once it had time to trim in, if I do see some of the results start to drop as the ECU compensates for whatever I've done to it. Regardless, I'm still surprised and impressed that something I read on the internet came out so true. If you liked this, please consider liking and subscribing. It makes the Fat Man really happy. And thanks for watching.